In our hermeneutics course, this is lecture 17. In this lecture, we will briefly look at 5 more literary genres, which will, as we understand these genres, will help us to better interpret the Bible. One very distinct genre is called apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature describes cataclysmic events about the end of the world. The language is frequently, but not always, symbolic. Does the Old Testament help in understanding the symbols? Certainly. Remember that our second rule of interpretation: use the most natural and normal meaning of a word unless the text demands a figurative meaning, still applies. This rule still applies. Just because we shift into apocalyptic literature doesn't mean we can now ignore that principle of hermeneutics. In fact, all 4 rules of interpretation discussed in our previous lectures are perfectly valid and applicable in apocalyptic literature. The definition of apocalyptic literature is debated and uncertain. In this wonderful little book by Leon Morris, the book is called Apocalyptic. Leon Morris discusses the definition of apocalyptic literature and the various arguments about that. But for us, it's enough to say that Daniel 7 through 12 and Zechariah 12 through 14 are usually considered apocalyptic in the Old Testament. And in New Testament, many would agree that Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are apocalyptic. Everyone has to agree that Revelation is apocalyptic because the name of this genre is taken from the first word in Greek of the book of Revelation. Poetry is another very significant genre in the Bible, especially in the Psalms. Poetry appeals to the emotions and the imagination. The Psalms are all Hebrew poetry. Unlike old-fashioned English poetry, the Psalms don't rhyme, but they use a parallelism in their sentence structure. The second line of a verse in the Psalms reinforces the first line by repeating it or extending its thought. It's very easy to see in almost all verses in the Psalms. It's good to look for the central theme of a psalm. What are the emotions the psalm brings up? What question does the psalm ask or answer? What does it say about God or about humanity? What images are used in the psalm? Of course, here's an image. What's the reality that that image is describing? And why does this image work with that reality? Does the psalm refer to events that are described elsewhere in the Bible? Sometimes the psalms do discuss events that are already mentioned in other parts of the Bible. Another genre, proverbs. A proverb is a short, practical nugget of truth that often shows the consequences of a behavior. Proverbs often, also like Psalms, proverbs often use parallelism, the same kind of parallelism. The proverbs are direct and to the point. Proverbs contain principles, not quite promises. Another genre for us to consider is narrative. Narrative is about story. The story is prominent. It might be a historical story, real history. It might be a fictional narrative. That's fine. Watch, of course, with narrative literature, in the genre narrative, you want to look for the plot. What's the plot of the story? It could be a physical, spiritual, relational, political plot. Watch for development in the unfolding of the plot. What's different at the end of the story and why? Note also characterization. How does the author of the narrative characterize the people in the story? How does he develop who they are and what they're like? Characterization. Who are the characters? How are they described? What roles do they play? Watch for these things. What are their decisions and how do they relate to each other and to God? What progress do the characters make? Do the characters change in the story? Do the characters fail? Why do they fail? Are these characters, besides being historical, perhaps in historical narrative, these are historical characters, are they also representative of others? Culpepper's book on the Gospel of John describes how the characters of the Gospel of John, I mean, in my understanding, they are historical characters. They're real men and women, but they also are, they characterize different kinds of people in the world today. But they are real people in the Gospel, in the Gospel of John. What would we do in this or that character's place? Do we like or dislike this or that character? Why do we like or dislike these characters? Of course, you want to note whether the story is true to life or not. What questions does this story raise? What are the problems that the characters have to deal with? What do the characters learn as a part of their development through the story? Are there things we need to avoid? What do they learn about God? Among others, the historical books of the Old Testament and Acts in the New Testament are narrative literature. And then just one more in our brief survey of the kind of literary genres of the Bible, we should mention biographic literature, biographic narrative. Some narrative literature is biographic literature. It focuses on individuals. What can we learn by studying all about David, or Paul, or Peter, or John? Actually, in the Gospel of John, comparing Peter and John makes an interesting study. Certainly there are biographic elements in the Gospel stories. So there are many different literary genres in the Bible. And when we read, we should be conscious of what is the genre that I'm reading right now so that we will treat it appropriately. And this is the end of our lecture 17 on genres of the Bible.